Welcome to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Sarah Jane Leslie. A wealth of psychological evidence suggests that from a young age we implicitly believe that humans and other animals have within them an essence that makes them what they are. These essences, almost substance-like entities that pervade the creature's insides, causally ground its stable and enduring properties. We further believe that certain kinds, natural kinds, carve essence at its joints, as it were. Tigers form a real and objective kind because of their shared essences. This, we think, explains why individual tigers are so similar to one another, why they tend to have stripes, tails, and evidence ferocious behavior. These beliefs emerge throughout the preschool years in the absence of explicit instruction about, say, genes and DNA, and are found across a broad range of diverse cultural contexts. Children who grow up in a scientifically advanced community may later come to articulate these beliefs using the vocabulary of modern genetics, but the beliefs themselves are pre-scientific and often scientifically inaccurate. One realm in which these essentialist beliefs have arguably exerted a powerful and negative effect on the course of human history is that of race. Race is not perceived as a simple, superficial matter of variation in skin color, but rather racial differences are all too often thought to reflect something deep and underlying, differences we might suppose in essence. As we might expect, these essentialist beliefs will cloak themselves in the cover of science. A recent survey of American adults found that the majority of people agreed with the claim that two people from the same race will always be more genetically similar to each other than two people from different races. This conception of race is not a recent development. Before the language of DNA was widely available, different races were compared to different species or subspecies. As Thomas Jefferson, himself a vigorous opponent of slavery, wrote, "I advance it as a suspicion that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications. Will not a lover of natural history, then, one who views gradations in all the races of animals with the eye of philosophy, excuse an effort to keep those in the department of man as distinct as nature has formed them?" What light does modern science throw on these claims? Does it vindicate the widespread belief that interracial variation is always greater than intraracial variation? Do our racial concepts carve nature at its biological joints? Or are our racial concepts no more than false, destructive, unscientific articulations of childish convictions? And most importantly, perhaps, what are the ethical, social, and political ramifications of how these questions are answered? We're joined today by Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is one of the foremost scholars of race of our time. Dr. Appiah is professor of philosophy and law at NYU. He has held appointments in philosophy and African American studies at Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, the University of Ghana, and other institutions. Professor Appiah was recently awarded the National Humanities Medal and has been named by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the leading global thinkers of our time. Professor Appiah, thanks so much for joining us. Now, what is the status, scientifically speaking, of the claim that two individuals of the same race will always be genetically more similar than two individuals of different races?
Basically, that's terrible science. It's not consistent, I think, with, to make a claim like that precise, you'd have to talk about how you want to measure degrees of difference and so on. You'd have to specify some specific way of doing it. But on a natural way of doing it, one way of thinking about this is that Richard Lewontin, who's a distinguished Harvard geneticist, argued many years ago that if you look at the range of human biological variation, about 85% of it is in most local populations, so that the amount of added variation you get when you move from, say, Norway to adding in everybody in Africa is another 15% or so. And just to be sort of careful about this, you have to begin by saying that what notion of race are you actually operating with? So we're in the United States, you and I at the moment, so let's use what I take to be, roughly speaking, the American notion. And I'm saying that because the notions that are in play are different in different places, and that's a really important fact. The notion that's in play in the United States tends to be one in which, roughly speaking, people think that if you have one African American parent, you're an African American. That's the so-called one-drop rule. And then now, supposing that Americans think that this notion of race can be applied across the board so that Africans and African Americans belong to the same race, by that criterion, someone who has an African grandfather is black.
Right.
Okay, so that includes my Norwegian nephew, whose grandfather is my father, whose mother is my sister, and whose father is a Norwegian. I have three of those. I can offer you three samplings of the human population that are 1/4 African, half Norwegian, and a quarter British. And one of them is my color. One of them is your color, but fairer than you, with blonde hair and gray eyes. And one of them is in between the two. Those three I remember once, the eldest one of them was visiting here, and we were talking with my African American nieces, and they told this blonde boy that he was black by this criterion, and he found it completely mysterious. He'd never lived it was his first visit to the United States. He lives in Africa. He was not used to this way of thinking. But the point about him is, if he's African American, or if he's black by this one-drop criterion, he's also way more like most Norwegians in a vast number of biologically interesting properties than the average black American. So you can get people, once you define these groups by descent in this way, it's very easy to get people who belong to the same descent group, but are very, very different from each other biologically, and in fact more like people in some other descent group by the mechanism that my nephew was produced by.
Of course, one might say at this point in the conversation that these considerations of descent, rules such as the one-drop rule, none of this necessarily rules out that there isn't some core biological notion at play in race.
The question we're talking about is this: is there a biologically useful notion of race? There are lots of other ways of thinking about race and that are non-biological, and we can discuss those later. But is there a useful biological notion of race? Is there, and what would that be? That would be a way of classifying people that was useful for some theoretical or practical biological purpose. The fact that most of human variation is in all the local populations is one reason for thinking that isn't very likely to turn out to be correct, because classifications are supposed to break things up into, as it were, people who are like this and people who are like that. Well, if most of the variation is everywhere, that's not going to be a very good use for it. Is there a theoretical explanatory purpose for some notion of race? Well, I don't think so, because after all, what are you trying to explain? What are the sorts of things that race might be used to explain? Well, human variation. What explains the fact that some people have darker skin than others? Answer: the genetics of the genes that determine skin color and the distribution of melanocytes in the human skin. Once you've given that explanation, there isn't an extra explanation, and by the way, race does something or other. You've given the whole explanation, but that explanation didn't mention race, and I don't see where would you fit race into that explanatory story? So the reason why biologists don't use the notion of race isn't political correctness or the fact that they've, as it were, somebody's discouraged them from outside. It's because they haven't got a use for it.
So would a way of summarizing the point be that while there is some biological sense to be made of, say, continent-based ancestral groups, first of all, these are merely statistical correlates of phenotypic characteristics. Secondly, they don't actually track how we employ the notion of race in everyday contexts, as shown by, say, the one-drop rule in the United States. But finally, perhaps the psychological salience of these categories, arguably due to our psychological essentialist tendencies, can lead us to overemphasize the usefulness of these categories.
We give them too much weight. It's important, though, that the sort of, if you're thinking of this as a kind of geographic, roughly speaking, were most of your ancestors in 1492 in Africa, or in East Asia, or in South Asia, or in Europe, right, or in the Americas? If that's the question you're asking, it's really important to notice the following two important facts. One, there's no sharp boundary in any of this. As you move through Ethiopia into the Arabian Peninsula and over into South Asia, there are just gradients of distributions of all the interesting things. There are no sharp boundaries. Even the color boundary even the colors are just move, gradually. And so no sharp boundaries, and they don't change together. So the skin color distribution is different from the hemoglobin S distribution, is different from the dentition distribution, is different from the eye color distribution, and so on. There's no concordance among all the different forms of variation. Well, there's not no concordance, there's low concordance, and in general, we're inclined, because of our psychological essentialism, to suppose that there will be some interesting, deep fact that connects two people to whom we've assigned to the same social race, and very generally speaking, at the biological level, there isn't. Now, very generally speaking, by the way, there often isn't at every other level too. That is to say, two African Americans, no reason to think that they'll have the same taste in music, no reason to think that they'll belong to the same church, no reason to think that they'll vote for the same party. Well, maybe they will for the Democratic Party, but but that has a social explanation. So I think, and in general, as I say, we're inclined to overrate the information content of these categorizations, which is why people who are doing serious work on human variation don't use them, because they're not actually all that useful.
And this just may be a case where this very early developing cognitive disposition that we have leads us to perceive boundaries to be sharp when they aren't, perceive differences to be underlying, fundamental, and deeply explanatory, and also to perceive there to be far more intra-category uniformity than in fact there is.
So it's both that, I think, in a way, more important than the fact of what it gets wrong about where the differences between people who are assigned to black and white and yellow and brown, is that it gets wrong the differences within those groups. It exaggerates the homogeneity of the groups that we call white and black and yellow and brown. And that was why I think Lewontin's insistence that 85% of human variation is within these groups. So if you're interested in human biological variability, where your ancestors were in 1400 turns out not to be the most interesting question. It's not the most interesting source of human variation, is not that question.
Modern science simply does not vindicate the idea that racial categories reflect deep, fundamental biological differences between people. One might wonder whether we should conclude from this that there simply are no races.
I used to think of myself as a sort of an eliminativist about in the philosophical jargon about these things. That is, I used to think that what I wanted to say was that there are no races, and I'm, in some moods I'll still say that. And the reason I don't want to say it is just that it's slightly misleading, because it suggests that you're denying something else, which I don't want to deny, which is that in our social life, these categories, which we use biological markers for, even if very inadequately and inaccurately, are hugely important. I think it would be crazy to deny that racial categories are important in the United States. What I'm just denying is that the reason they're important is something to do with the underlying biology. I don't think the reason they're important is, and similarly, I don't think the reason why women have less income than men has to do with the underlying biology, even though there is an underlying biological difference between sort of typical men and typical women.
So where do you think we should go as far as these notions of race? How should we understand them? Should we try to alter them?
Many of the bad practices in relation to race, many of the racist practices, don't go away just because you explain that the biological understanding of race is a mistake, so you have to do more work than that. On the other hand, I don't think it follows from these biological critiques that there isn't a place, a positive place, for social notions of race, at least sometimes and for some periods and in some places. Surely the formation of a sort of positive black identity was an important process in American history in coming out of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and racism. Whether we're going to need that in the long haul, that's a different question, but I don't think there's any reason to think that we've reached the point where it can't continue to be a useful form of identity.
Despite the deliverances of biology, essentialist beliefs about race persist. Current research in psychology suggests that these essentialist beliefs are linked in important ways to stereotyping and prejudice. Do you think there could be a tension between, on the one hand, wanting to recognize the positive effects of these forms of identity and our tendency to be psychological essentialists and therefore interpret these sorts of categories as revealing underlying reality?
So I think that's a really interesting element of that should be in the debate about how we proceed with our racial categories. My own, I think there's a lot to be said for the simple device of asking ourselves when we do assign people to racial categories, do I need to do this for this purpose? I mean, do I really need to do this? Can I not think, for example, more adjectively about people than substantively, as you've suggested? I think that those are all questions worth asking, and to answer them sensibly, one has to begin with a proper understanding of the psychological mechanisms of what psychologists mean by essentializing, and then to figure out how adaptable we are. I think that it remains the case that someone like me, who I suppose is relatively sophisticated in his thinking about the underlying biology and so on, I still know that I'm inclined, if I don't rein myself back, as it were, to make assumptions on the basis of these categories that I know, in theory, are unwarranted. I think I make them less than I would if I didn't know these things, so I'm glad I know these things, but I probably still make them more than I should. And so there is a question about whether the things that I say are positive possibilities for these forms of identity are worth the cost. Right. And there's a cognitive cost. We persist, for example, in looking for explanations for things that are actually, when you try to think about it, you can't even define what the question really is. I mean, the question about race and IQ, it's very hard to know what the question is supposed to be because there isn't a variable there. One of the variables, well, IQ is also a dodgy variable in my view, but even if IQ were a respectable variable, what is the question that is being asked? And yet, I don't know whether the National Science Foundation, I don't know how much money the National Science Foundation spends on research that is in some way about this question, but I bet it isn't nothing.
I mean, I think one way that you can critique specifically that enterprise, and this also comes up in the case of gender, when you've got a societal structure that disadvantages one group relative to another, well, across a wide range of contexts, that's going to produce decreased performance on behalf of the disadvantaged group. But then if we're viewing these groups as reflecting deep fundamental differences between people, and we're thinking of the performance as indicating something underlying and inherent, as most people do with IQ, not understanding it as a performance thing, but rather thinking it reflects my inherent intelligence, say, then we may just fall into this trap of thinking that this disadvantaged group underperforms not because they're disadvantaged, but because they're inherently inferior, which just, of course, props up then the disadvantaging system.
And look, suppose it were true that there was some small difference in some kind of capacity in these groups, these socially defined groups. it would still be the case that it would be really important to eliminate all the other sources of inequality. And until we've done that, we really don't know what the answer is to the question. And we certainly haven't done that. And I think one of the really interesting bodies of research now is research into the social and psychological and academic mechanisms by which inferiority is produced, as it were, and things like stereotype threat. These are really interesting. That's really interesting research because it helps to explain some of the eliminable sources of inequality.
Where stereotype threat is the phenomenon whereby a group that's perceived to be inferior at a particular test or activity, say, if they're just reminded of their identity as a member of that group, that impairs their performance.
They tend to perform less well. And I think we have this global phenomenon that on these cognitive performance tests, groups that are subjected to contempt and inferiorization do less well on them. I don't know why anyone finds that surprising, but nevertheless, we do find this globally. And we also find that if you take people from those groups and put them somewhere where they're not inferiorized, suddenly it goes away. So that does suggest that there's not going to turn out to be very much that's explained by the differential distribution of these capacities by, let's say, where your ancestors were in 1400.
It's kind of interesting if we take it into a more neutral context, say language acquisition. We consider Noam Chomsky's argument for the existence of an innate language faculty. Any arguments, whatever one thinks of their success or failure, depends on the idea that what we come to know about language couldn't possibly be taken from the input. And no one would ever say in those circumstances, oh, sure, you could learn it all from the input, but nonetheless, I insist it's innate. And yet in these sorts of contexts, even though we know that this input of disadvantaging would suffice to produce these differences in performance, nonetheless, people still think that the difference in performance is got to be evidence for inherent inferiority.
I know. Well, and I think it's hard to explain why people respond in that way except by understanding them to be essentializing. That is, by supposing that there must be some deep and important feature that underlies the racial categorization that then explains the other stuff. And that, of course, is what the project of race science began as. It began as an attempt to understand the distribution, the differential distribution of human variation. That's an interesting and important topic. It turns out that a lot of the stuff that we're most interested in terms of human variability is not very much rooted in biology. Lots more of it turns out to be cultural than you might have thought in 1880. But no doubt some of it is biological. One doesn't have to deny either that there are important genetic differences between people, or that some of them are statistically correlated with where your ancestors were in 1400. But neither of those facts is a reason to essentialize. And as I say, I think that the evidence is that an awful lot of the things that people thought had a biological basis and they were associated with important forms of inequality just turn out not to have one. And there are other explanations. From my point of view, more interesting explanations, since it's rather boring, I think, to say about some form of difference. Well, it's just there in the body to begin with.
Right. So a pressing question, not one for us to settle here and now, would be how might we undermine this tendency that we have from a very young age to essentialize, particularly to essentialize certain problematized social groups?
Well, that's one of the costs of having these categories in our language, and it's really important to remind people that this way, there've always been essentializing categories, there've always been ways of what I call making people into peoples. If you read the Old Testament, it's full of the names of hundreds and hundreds of peoples: Hittites, Amalekites, Syrians, Assyrians, Medes, Persians. There's lots and lots of kinds of people. But this particular way of doing it, which classifies people into roughly 5 groups on the supposed basis of skin color, though actually if you look at the color of people's skins, it turns out that that's not really what's going on. But still, on the supposed basis of skin color. That is a new thing. It's basically a post-1492 thing. It's a result of European expansion into the world. it was a reasonable hypothesis faced with human variation, that a lot of it was accounted for by some deep feature of difference that was associated with these superficial differences. It was a reasonable hypothesis, but we investigated it, and it turns out that it's mostly not so. So then we have to figure out whether it's useful to have these terms in our language at all. After all, if we still talked about phlogiston, there would be this tendency, right, to think about certain things as consisting of dephlogisticated air. I mean, even if we knew that there wasn't any such thing as phlogiston, if people talked about it all the time, right, it would kind of gain a reality. So that's what I mean by saying we've got to think about the costs. I say it's important that there are benefits of at least some forms of social identity, and I think that's true. But they do come with costs, and if the essentializing is going to get in our way, as it certainly very often does, then there is a question about whether one shouldn't be more rigorously eliminativist, as I used to be, and just say, look, we'd do better if we didn't have these terms, we didn't talk to children using these terms. Because children won't, I mean, the essentializing has to be triggered. They're not going to spontaneously essentialize, as it were, Negro as a category. There's got to be some context, because there are too many things you might essentialize. Yeah. So the particular ones that a particular set of children essentialize has to do with the context in which they're raised. And I know this very well from my own background, because of course the racial categories that I grew up with in West Africa, in Ghana where I grew up, and in England where I spent my teens and early 20s, and here in the United States, they're all different. And children essentialize different things in these different places because they live with different languages and different traditions. And I think it really is an important question for us to say, what should we be trying to raise children who are in the way in which some people use the term, who are colorblind, that is, not who don't notice that people come in different colors, but don't get invited very young to essentialize these differences and to therefore think, okay, he's black, so he's going to be very like him, because she's black, and also to think bound to be different from her because she's white. And I think there is a real set of questions about this, about these categories.
An interesting point in all of this, if I can mention my own work here, if that's not inappropriate. So a recent experiment I conducted with Marjorie Rhodes at NYU and Christina Tworek, we took preschool children, showed them exemplars of a completely novel social category. We called it the Zarpies, and they were fully diverse for race, ethnicity, gender, and age. And we just manipulated whether children heard the group described with generic language. Look at this Zarpie. Zarpies climb tall fences. Or with specific language, look at this Zarpie. This Zarpie climbs tall fences. And we found that just that simple manipulation produced in 4-year-olds a significantly greater tendency to essentialize this otherwise novel and diverse social group. So it may not even necessarily just be a feature of having the nouns in the language, but also parental input, specifically in the form of these generic generalizations.
Right. Yes. Well, you've persuaded me, your work has persuaded me that generics are very dangerous. I mean, they're useful, so I don't mean that, but they're also dangerous. And I think we've reached an interesting point in our intellectual development where we're learning things about how our social practices interact with our sort of psychological predispositions, and we're in the position of being able to think seriously about changing some of the things we do because the downstream consequences of doing them are bad. And we're, in the past, people have had some false beliefs about this sort of thing, but on the whole, they haven't had a lot of knowledge about it. And I think that race is a very good example of a field, a domain in which we now know a lot more even than when I started working 20, 30 years ago on these things. We know a lot more about the relevant psychology, and so we have a lot more to think about in terms of how we change our social practices, including just the ways we talk about things, which turn out to be to have more substantial effects than I think one might have guessed.
Our tendency to perceive certain social categories as reflecting deep fundamental differences in essence has profound social consequences. Science, be it biology or psychology, has the potential to provide us with new insights into race and racism, and importantly, may offer us novel ways of combating social injustice. Professor Appiah, thank you so much for joining us on Philosophical Conversations.
Great, thank you very much. I had a good time.
It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.